Welcome to the Westport Library. Today's program will begin momentarily. Supported by Verso Studios, created locally and shared with the world.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Karen Savell, and I'm the CEO of the Jewish Federation of Greater Fairfield County. We are so happy to welcome you here tonight, and I think by the amount of people here, it's clear that there couldn't be a more timely opportunity to present the program tonight. I want to say thank you to our sponsors of the evening, our partners. We've worked so hard together, Connecticut Public Television and the Westport Library. So you are in for a real treat tonight. First, I would like to introduce the co-producer and co-director of the film, Sarah Botstein. Let me tell you a little bit about her. Sarah has produced some of the most prolific nonfiction programming for public television. Over the past 2 decades, her work with filmmakers Ken Burns and Lynn Novick and writer Jeffrey C. Ward includes jazz, the war, prohibition, the Vietnam War, College Behind Bars, and Hemingway. The U.S. and the Holocaust marks Sarah's debut as a co-director. The series tells the story of how the American people grappled with one of the greatest humanitarian crises in the 20th century. In addition to the television broadcasts, Botstein works on digital and educational initiatives with PBS Learning Media and WETA TV. She helps to oversee content for Ken Burns' Unum, a web-based platform and miniseries which highlights historical themes throughout the Florentine Films body of work. Currently, Sarah is producing an epic 6-part, 12-hour series on the American Revolution and a multi-series on Lyndon Johnson's life and presidency. Please help me welcome Sarah Botstein.
Crash on the stairs. Anyway, thank you, Karen. Thank you to the Jewish Federation. I met Karen in Chicago where she chased me down after doing an event similar to this. And I'm really grateful to be here in Westport, Connecticut. My mother actually grew up here and went to Staples High School, so it's really fun to be home. For her, I wish she was here tonight. And to public television in a greater way. I have spent my entire professional career working in public television, and I'm deeply committed to its enterprise and its work with libraries, so it's really fun to be here. I think I'm supposed to just tell you guys a little bit about how we ended up making this film and introduce about 10 minutes of the 6.5 hours that we're going to show you tonight to spark a conversation. Back in 2015, when we were in the sort of apex of making a big series on the Vietnam War, it came to our attention that the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. was embarking on an exhibition called Americans and the Holocaust, looking at what Americans knew, what we knew, and when we knew information about the persecution of European Jewry and the crisis in Europe. And did we think it would be an interesting topic for a documentary? And I'll speak for Ken and Lynn and our writer, Jeff Ward, that we all jumped at the chance to make the film and actually made room in our schedule and accelerated other projects and delayed different projects to make room for it in the schedule. And that was in 2015. And, you know, I don't think we could have imagined how relevant looking at that history would become while we were making the film. And we can have a more substantive conversation about that tonight. But the film really does examine the dynamics between the humanitarian crisis and the World War crisis and complicated aspects of American history and how they inform decisions that we make as a government and as a people. So I think we're going to show you 2 short clips, one from the first episode and one from the second episode, looking at the dynamics of Germany and the United States and what kind of a country we were then and how we made the decisions that we made and how we responded to the crisis of European Jews. So I think, what else is that it? Okay, so we're gonna watch the 2 clips and then be joined for, I hope, a really interesting conversation. And thank you again, I'm really happy to be here.
Good evening. How are you tonight? Good, good. Thank you, thank you. My name is Ray Hardman. I'm the arts and culture reporter for Connecticut Public Radio and Television. It's my pleasure to be here tonight. And let me introduce our panelists. Of course, you know Sarah Botstein. Sarah, such a beautiful, maddening, myth-busting endeavor. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I'm
Please.
excited about the conversation.
Let me introduce our other panelists. Right here we have Christopher Viles. He's the Associate Professor of English at the University of Connecticut Storrs. He's also the Director of American Studies. Most of his work has focused on class, race, and social movements in the 20th century. Since 2012, much of his work has been on anti-fascism and American fascist movements. He's appeared on PBS, NPR, and CBC Radio to discuss manifestations of fascism in the United States. And here in the middle is Dr. Glenn Diner. He is the Carl and Dorothy Bennett Professor of Judaic Studies and Director of the Bennett Center at Fairfield University. Since 2014, Diner has served as a Professor of Religion and Chair of the Religion Department at Sarah Lawrence College. He is the recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship. Gentlemen, welcome. And Sarah, I know you have to scoot off soon, so I want to ask some questions from you right away.
I'm just leaving at 8 to put my children to bed, but I'll be here for a while. Yeah.
Can you put them to bed and come back?
I live far away, but
Okay.
yes, otherwise I would do that.
No, and again, congratulations on this film. Could you talk briefly about the production process? Did it start with that trip to the U.S. Holocaust Museum?
Sure, yeah. Well, you know, I think Ken always says this, and it's worth people who are interested in our process of how we make our films, that really our process is very similar. Doesn't really matter what the subject is, the Vietnam War, Prohibition, Ernest Hemingway, this subject. The first thing we do is meet scholars and historians and writers and intellectuals who have spent their lives thinking about the subject matter, and we get to know them, and they work both behind the scenes and sometimes also in front of the camera, as you saw with a bunch of the historians in the film tonight. And our writer, Jeff Ward, goes into his apartment and he spends several years research and writing, totally separate, not entirely, but he's writing and we're figuring out how to interview people. And for this film, we were not only interested in the scholars, but also first-person testimony and survivors. And the people who are alive that survived this period of time and made it here are quite old now and were children then. So you're dealing with childhood memory, childhood trauma, trying to both get their oral histories and their family stories so that the audiences can connect to the crisis facing people trying to get here. And interweaving those with the archival material. And when you're delving into a subject like this, we can talk about, you know, the choice of imagery, what's available, where this stuff comes from, and then to have our audiences, hopefully without being, you know, didactic and hammering them over the head, to think a little bit about who's in the images, who took the pictures. And, you know, when we set out to make the film, I think it's worth people knowing that we couldn't have imagined, when we decided to make a film called The U.S. and the Holocaust, how much of the actual Holocaust we were going to tell. And I think to understand the American response and to do a responsible job in tackling the subject, you actually have to explain for an American audience the chronology of what happened to the Jews of Europe, which I think in our kind of public understanding, people sort of know 6 million Jews died. They probably think a lot of them died in Germany. They know very little about the Eastern Front, and they certainly don't know the number of Jews who died in what's now commonly thought of as the Shoah by bullets, but long before an American soldier was in North Africa, Italy, let alone Normandy. And so I think we wanted Americans to have an understanding of what happened there so that they could have a more clear-eyed way of processing what our response was, which really I think goes to the crux of the thesis of the film, is basically that America has, since its founding, really struggled with what kind of a country we are. Are we a land of refuge for the oppressed and a land of immigrants, or do we have, I mean, are we more of a white supremacist, nativist, xenophobic, racist, and deeply anti-Semitic country? And the tension of that is what every generation faces. And we're seeing that right now.
Sarah, I want to ask you some more production questions. And
Okay.
I'm really curious, how do you get started, you and the team, how do you get started on a subject so intense and so broad?
We read. We meet people who've spent their lives talking about it. We work we work in a very traditional form. We work really chronologically. We don't work thematically. So we tell a story and we try to find interesting personal stories connected to the geopolitical history so that it doesn't feel like dry dates and facts and a lot of information that you're kind of struggling as an audience. I know I have this, we're making a film on the American Revolution, and today we're in the editing room and my brain shuts off how many troops, it was how many miles, and how, like, I can't, and I'm working on the film, so if I can't keep track of it, our audience is definitely not gonna be able to keep track of it. So people need to care about some part of the actual history to be able to digest the statistics, I would argue.
I love how you were able to use Anne Frank's family as kind of a door into this whole thing. How did you find out that information about the Frank family?
Well, when we started making the film, the wonderful research organization in New York, YIVO, had recently acquired Otto Frank's papers. And in his papers are letters and documents showing how desperately he and the Frank family had tried to get to the United States. Now, Anne Frank is the entry point for many, many, many people, not just here, around the world, to understand some of this history. And I didn't know her family had tried to get here, and I think most of Americans didn't know that she and her family tried to get here, and that if they had been successful, Anne Frank would very likely be alive and here with us tonight. So that set us on an interesting journey of, okay, if we're going to start the film with some aspect of the Frank family, which will surprise American audiences, then we kind of set off on a long path of trying to understand more about Anne Frank, which we can talk about later. So yes, we've thought a lot about Anne Frank. It's the 75th anniversary of the publication of that diary, I think the founding of the diary.
This is a question for everyone, all the panelists. The U.S. and the Holocaust explores what it was like to live during a time when authoritarianism was on the rise. Right now, we see the fragility of democracies in all countries all over the world. Here in the U.S., we're just a few weeks out from the midterm elections. Would you say that we saved U.S. democracy from a move toward authoritarianism, or is authoritarianism an ongoing temptation, an ongoing threat? Is it part of human nature?
You guys are up.
Jump in.
Okay, I guess I'll tackle that one. You want to start? No, okay. Sorry. Well, I definitely wouldn't say authoritarianism is necessarily, or fascism is necessarily part of human nature, but certainly we dodged somewhat of a bullet, but I don't think we fully dodged a bullet in the sense that I think what recent events have shown is that probably around 30%, 33% of the US population is easily formatted towards an authoritarian takeover of government, basically, away from a democracy. And historically, what's important about that too is if you look at the rise of fascism and the rise of actual fascist states, you don't need a majority necessarily to be behind the authoritarian leader. You only need about 35 to 36%. Fascism doesn't come to power after fascists win elections. Fascists comes to power after they lose elections, right? So you really only need about 33% or so to really kind of be formatted for authoritarianism, and that's what we've seen. So,
Glenn, you care to?
Yeah, so I'm more of a historian of Poland and Polish Jewry, but I think there are a lot of parallels here that we should address. You know, there was kind of a perfect storm in the 1930s. One of those ingredients I don't think is there right now, and that is economic crisis, like deep economic crisis. I think we'd be looking at a very more dangerous situation were that the case, but a lot of the other ingredients are there. You have the breakdown of community, social isolation, and these kinds of I would say, superficial communities created. At that time, it was newspapers and political party meetings where you could gain a sense of community by airing common grievances. And now you have, of course, the internet and other social media. You have, I would say, a majority dominant culture that's feeling encroached upon, really feeling deep anxiety about marginal groups kind of impinging on their power, their predominance. That's definitely happening now, and it's really exacerbated by immigration. And you had all these ingredients in the 1930s. So yeah, I think it's an ever-present danger. I was shocked by politics of the past few years, but when I went into the archives and read the media in Poland from the 1930s, one thing I noticed, why I shouldn't have been surprised, is you can say whatever you want in certain forums. You know, there was no accountability in the press in the 1930s. You could just sort of get into your bubble and shout, or your echo chamber, and just shout whatever you wanted with no accountability, no fear of any kinds of consequences. And we may be there right now with our new kinds of technologies and social media.
No, I think those are all really important points.
Yeah. Chris, this is a question for you. What factors made the U.S. susceptible to fascism in the early part of the 20th century, the 20s, 30s, 40s, and are those factors still at play today?
Yeah, sure. They're absolutely still at play today. I mean, the kind of root soil of fascist movements, not just in the U.S., but in large parts of the world, of, you know, white supremacy and the ability to identify with whiteness. In the United States, you had a history of settler colonial violence against indigenous people as well. That was another wellspring of male violence. Anytime you have a culture that kind of facilitates militarism or hypermasculinity, you've got the well springs for this. But when we're thinking about fascism, say in a place like the United States or outside of the few states, it's important to keep in mind the distinction between fascist states and fascist movements and authoritarian personalities, right? Mercifully, there's been very few fascist states. You know, Germany and Italy are the two that scholars would all agree on, but also Spain, Japan, right? But there's been fascist movements in virtually every country in the world at this point, including the United States. But it's important to study the fascist movements even when they don't take power and they don't convert the state into a fully fascist state, because those movements can do a lot of damage to democracy even if they don't take power, right? They can do a lot of damage. And historically, y'all pegged some excellent ones from the 30s, not excellent ones, but so ones that were very historically important in the 30s. In the early part of the 20th century, what was striking is in the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan, which was a mass movement, it achieved its peak in the 20s, was really behind a lot of those immigration laws. Their lobbying was behind a lot of the immigration laws that kept Jewish refugees from entering the country, right? And that was the functional equivalent of fascist movement. But also in the 30s, particularly Coughlin, you know, and Father Charles Coughlin had a radio audience of possibly up to 10 million people, which is about 10% of the US population. And it was a strikingly big up here, actually. So Boston, New York, these were his, any place you had a large urban concentration of Irish Catholics, you had a lot of people, right, who supported that. So, you know, it got so bad, his kind of hooligans beating up people they tagged as Jewish in the streets, that became such a pervasive problem that there started to form kind of Jewish American kind of youth defense leagues in New York City and Boston just to protect their neighborhoods, right? So yeah, I think your film does an excellent job at really kind of focusing and honing in on distinctly fascist threats in the United States.
Sarah, the archival footage, I mean, all Ken Burns productions have amazing archival footage, but this went above and beyond. Tell me a little bit about how you were able to obtain the archival stuff.
Well, I think the thing that makes this project a little bit unique is that we actually edited and did a huge amount of the research at the height of COVID. So we were doing research in a different way than we normally do. And people are always interested to learn that we were scrambling to get archival material out of Russia and the Ukraine right before the invasion to be able to finish the film. And also, because of the global lockdown, we were able to find extraordinary filmmakers in Poland who went into the Ukraine and filmed throughout Poland when the world was shut down. So the places are eerily empty, not because we got Auschwitz to close the museum, but because there was nobody there. So we were able to film and work with people in a very different way than our normal process is for some of the research. But, you know, people are usually curious to learn that a lot of what we do is kind of like being an archive in a library ourselves. We have an amazing team of producers and researchers, and we sort of philosophically divide up. So some people are really become experts in still photography. Others become deeply immersed in the newsreel moving images. And then for this film, a lot of newspaper reporting. What was reported? Where was it reported? Where was it placed? What did Americans know? I think lots of Americans, one of the myths about this topic is that we didn't know very much about what was happening to the Jewish people of Europe, and that's just actually not true. We didn't see a lot of images of what was happening, but we absolutely knew it was happening. So we divide up and we become experts, and we, you know, for every photograph that's in the film, there's 10 that aren't in the film. So we bring in a huge amount of material, and then we try to understand, like I was saying earlier, where is that picture taken? Who's in it? What's important about it? How? And then we have amazing editors who spend 2 years trying to put that together. They're pacing it, they're adding music. I mean, it's, you know, we're making a movie, not writing a book or an essay. But we also felt grave responsibility when dealing with certainly the images of both the war and the humanitarian crisis. And how much of the horrific stuff do you show? I think we would argue you have to show enough that there's no question that it's real, and that the Holocaust denial, which you know, fascinating, but also responsibility to honor the memory and I think the grace and dignity that the Jewish people of Europe faced what was going to happen to them. So those were really intense conversations. We spent a lot of time. Ken always uses the word calibration, and I think it's an apt word for what we do.
I would imagine, I know in my own work, we have a phrase that's not very nice, but we call it killing puppies, which is not a very nice term. But what it means is you have some good things, you start a project, and you have a lot of really good ideas and good points you want to make. And then as time becomes an issue, when you start whittling it down, that's when you start having to kill puppies. Is that something that you have to deal with?
We usually say, you know, too many notes.
That's much nicer.
That's our way of, you can steal
nicer.
that, you know, from Mozart. But yes, it's just too many notes.
Too many notes.
Too many notes. And Ken always says this, so I'll just pretend he's here with us. You know, our cutting room floor is not filled with boring, bad stuff. It's just too much for an audience to contain. And it's not like we make short movies. So, you know, it's...
Well, I was wondering, you know, you had 6 hours to cover
I know,
this.
we love it when you can... Sometimes you can go somewhere in the country and someone comes up to us and we know they're going to ask us about jazz or baseball or whatever subject, the Vietnam War, and they often are mad at us for leaving something out, not for how long the movie is. So that always amuses me. You know, I actually, for this film, have talked more about the things we added at the very end rather than the things that didn't make it in. And we definitely have things that didn't make it in the final cut that I'm sorry aren't in. But some of the really thoughtful viewers who are advisors to the film made some important points, particularly about the Jews of Poland. And we added in the second and third episode are what's known in Jewish studies as last letters, people who knew they were going to die and wanted to leave some evidence of their life and a message. And those are very moving kind of telegrams of just to remind our audience in a different way about how the Jews of Europe were facing what was happening to them. And then also the dynamics. Our editors were very good at, I think, helping our audience very quickly go from the United States to Germany, the United States to the Eastern Front, to just constantly be showing that this is different fascinating things are happening in both countries. And how do you narratively do that? and visually do that. So the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which is an extremely important, very interesting historic moment, is tied to Peter Bergson and an interesting movement in the Jewish community, which again is not a monolith, and they were trying to understand how to respond to what was going on and didn't always agree to the Warsaw Uprising. And actually Peter Coyote, our narrator for many, many years, was reading narration in the final recording of a locked film, and he was reading what we had written for the Warsaw Uprising, and he said, "Do you know about the Ringelblum archive?" And we didn't know about it, so we're Googling in the narration session, and the Jews in the ghetto had buried in big milk cans things to remember them by: postcards, paintings, letters, newspaper clippings, just a human archive in the ground. And so we literally in real time rewrote that while Peter was recording narration, called our amazing team, one of whom is here tonight, Bella Feinstein, and that's, for me, one of the most moving scenes in the film, and was literally as we were delivering the film. So it's a very organic process, and we really are making changes until it goes up on the satellite.
Great, thank you. Glenn, let's focus for a moment on anti-Semitism. The U.S. and the Holocaust discusses anti-Semitic tropes that have been with us for centuries. The series also explores America's own history of anti-Semitism and white supremacy. Right now, it's on the rise. In 2021, the Anti-Defamation League tracked the highest number of anti-Semitic incidents in the U.S. since they've been taking records of those incidents in the 1970s. Glenn, can you talk about the ways anti-Jewish bigotry intersects with the targeting of democracy? And are there lessons from the past that can teach us about how to combat anti-Semitism today?
Okay.
The small one.
I think we should try to define anti-Semitism first.
Please.
And I think, if you had to summarize, it's really, it's exaggerated fears of Jewish power and collusion. It's a conspiracy theory, and it has many different facets, Jewish power over the economy through capitalism or communism, Jewish power, even religion, the power to kill God or the human embodiment of God, in early Christian claims, power over the media, power over Hollywood. These fears of Jewish power form a conspiracy theory that is very hard to refute because conspiracy is by definition secret. So ask for evidence and you're just going to be told, well, you can't see it, it's invisible. I think added to the potency is Jews are a kind of semi-visible or semi-invisible minority. You can kind of tell when somebody's Jewish, but not always. That lends to the sense of secretive, conspiracy. And there's, I think, you could say a lot of outgroups have theories about them and face prejudice, but this one has biblical resonance. So when in the film, Jewish immigrants are being accused of being foreign agents, for example, well, that links up very easily with New Testament themes like Judas and the betrayer and so on. So you really have this biblical dimension. So that's as a foreground. It's very tempting for a politician, especially in a democracy, to make recourse to these conspiracy theories, demagoguery. It's a temptation. You gain a lot of power, a lot of attention, and you seem to answer a lot of people's fears. You seem to give them something to explain a vastly sort of transformative modern era, and that's also part of the appeal, part of the allure. So what do we do to combat it? I think this is how you combat it, through education and through these kinds of forums. And one thing I say to my students sometimes is, let's be honest, Jews have been prominent in certain industries, in the media, in Hollywood. I mean, they're pioneers in Hollywood and banking and finance. It doesn't do much good to deny the prominent role, the success of Jews. As a very urbanized and literate group in forging these, but they're not colluding with each other. You know, they're in pretty tense competition with one another. There's no conspiracy, at least not one that I've been let in on. And that's the important thing to remember, is that there is no collusion, there is no kind of power threat by Jews as a group, perhaps as individuals, but not as a group.
What about the intersection of anti-Semitism and the targeting of democracy? Is there anything there?
Can you explain? Sorry.
Well, I mean, the erosion of democracy.
Okay, so, I mean, the erosion of democracy happens when you feel that there's something much more urgent than democracy. And your cause is so important, you're willing to suspend it. This happens on the left as much as on the right, you know. And I've heard environmentalists, for example, talk in ways that they too might be willing to suspend democracy. It's a sense of emergency or crisis, right, that causes you to suspend democracy as a luxury that we can no longer afford because we're in such a deep crisis and we have to do something to save the world. And that kind of attitude causes even the best of us to want to do away with democracy, and it's something to be constantly vigilant about, I think.
Great. By the way, I am remiss in mentioning that coming up in about 20-25 minutes, we're going to have time for you, the audience, to ask questions. We'll talk about that later, but we do have 2 microphones that will have people line up in front of to ask questions of the panel. But for now, let's focus on the stories that we tell ourselves about American history. There's been this long myth of American innocence. You know, we're the good guys, they're the bad guys, that type of thing. The U.S. and the Holocaust challenges that myth. It offers a more complex, nuanced, and sometimes not so pretty story about our history. How should we tell our nation's story when school boards across the country are wrestling with the question of teaching difficult history? One example is Mouse. It's a Pulitzer Prize-winning graphic novel about the Holocaust. It's being banned in some places. Some would say it's unpatriotic to challenge that American myth of innocence. And I just want to get some responses here.
You guys are up first.
No, I'm not. But yeah, right now in the United States, I mean, I think where I'm looking to also kind of with trepidation is a place like Hungary, right, where in the kind of memory wars over World War II, the Orban government basically has revived the Arrow Cross movement and the Horthy regime in Hungary, where the Horthy regime was kind of Holocaust complicit. The Arrow Cross was distinctly anti-Semitic murderous group that, you know, was responsible for like cooperating with the Nazis to send the Jewish population of Hungary to Auschwitz. Those are being revived as kind of heroes in the national mythos. And even the Croatian soccer team that was recently in the World Cup, there was all of this kind of Ustashi nostalgia for this very murderous anti-Semitic fascist puppet regime, right? And so those what I'm really kind of leery of, fortunately, I would say in the United States, for the most part, thanks to the cultural work of forums like this and your film, you know, the Holocaust is still, you know, a site of memory, right? And Nazism is still a bad word, right? And the figures associated with Nazism are still bad words. I'm very much kind of conscious of the fact of when that's, and leery and afraid of when that shifts to when we start seeing narratives of Father Coughlin as an American hero, when we start seeing the Klan openly kind of praised as national heroes. You know, in the universities, at least, you know, these topics, and at least in a lot of public schools in Connecticut, it seems like they're, for the most part, staying on top of a lot of this stuff. But at the same time, I am nervous about that shifting, so.
Well, I'd just like to add that, you know, education is not about making people feel comfortable. At the same time, yeah, you don't want kids feeling bad about themselves, and I often feel guilty. You know, I teach at a predominantly Catholic institution when I'm talking about Christian or Catholic anti-Semitism, you know, the Polish role in the Holocaust and things like that, and a lot of Polish Americans. You know, how do I go about doing this in a way that's not going to just push people away and make them feel bad about themselves somehow, but rather allow them to process things about their own past, their own heritage in a way that's healthy. I think this film does it brilliantly. That's one thing I was looking at very, very closely, was how do you tell this very difficult story, you know, at the same time, not forgetting the good things too. You know, there were positive aspects. I mean, really unparalleled, you know, opportunities that our country is based on. So I just thought that was brilliant about the film.
I mean, I'll talk about the education piece, and then I think to your point also, because, you know, history is complicated. Being alive is complicated. The human experience is complicated. I think to lean into that complication is rewarding for students, it's rewarding for viewers, it's rewarding at a dinner party. You don't, I think creating constructive spaces for people to learn so that you can see the past as a teacher, a warning, something to look to for the positive and the negative to make the future brighter for the next generation. I think that's how we approach our work. It's certainly how we approach the education materials. One of the reasons that I've spent my whole professional life in public television is because our films live on in the classroom. And for this film, it's very interesting. We did the educational materials kind of concurrent with making the film, which is a little bit new for us because Holocaust education is mandated, because there is such a spotlight on how to teach history constructively. There are these issues of, you know, Maus, and sometimes Anne Frank gets batted about in this space. It's not usually about the Holocaust where she gets, people are uncomfortable, but whatever sexual content is in the diary of Anne Frank is sometimes pushed against in the classroom, which is fascinating. You know, I think, you know, it's not about American innocence to me. It's about where our exceptionalism gets in the way. And it's important to remember how isolationist we were. America was not a country seen to be a great global beacon to make the world better and to be a superpower until fairly recently. And you know, I have a 12-year-old and a 5-year-old, and I think they both want to learn complicated stuff. They don't, and I think there is a way with teachers like you that you don't feel bad about yourself. You weren't alive then. That's like 2 generations of Germans going to Israel every summer to think about their pasts and how to make their lives better. So that's what animates what we do. And, you know, I'm a first-generation American. My father's family came here thanks to the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society in 1949 to a tiny immigrant neighborhood in the Bronx. And it took my grandparents 16 years to get here, and you know, they had a lot of connections. It's surprising to me, even having worked on the film, and they were so grateful to the United States. They could hold both those opposing sentiments. They, you know, my grandmother dressed up and never missed an election in her entire life. She, you know, I think encouraging our young people to be involved in democracy from a very young age. My earliest memories are going to voting booths with my grandparents and then my parents. And to your point earlier about, you know, the left and the right helped bring Hitler to power in different ways. So it is very important when you see a democracy begin to get onto shaky ground to look at the extremes of all parties and then to this small number of people that are required to bring those scary forces to power. And I think that's what we should work to push against, so we can celebrate all the great things about this amazing experiment in democracy and all the reasons that we should learn from the past and see it as a warning. It's not entirely an eloquent answer, but that's what I got.
We discover in the documentary that "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses" makes for a heartfelt poem, but it hardly reflected immigration policy and sentiment in the 1930s. Generally speaking, how does closing borders, restricting immigration and refugees have a detrimental effect on democracy?
Well, it is a reflection of, as you said, certain values are more important than an open society, right? And it reflects kind of basically a fear of difference that is always kind of one step removed from kind of absolute authoritarian politics. I'll say specifically too about the US immigration law in the 1930s, what is important to remember is that there was very little immigration to the United States from about 1924 up into 1965, right? Because of the Klan and other hyper-xenophobic nativist organizations in the 20s that shut down the borders through the Quota Act of 1921 and the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924 that made it slowed immigration down to a trickle, and that was based off fears largely of immigrants from Eastern Europe and Italy, right? So I'll tell my students, when we look at kind of anti-immigrant literature from the Klan and other organizations in the 20s, and they're making the structure of the argument is the same as today, even though it was directed in quote unquote legal immigrants. It's like, well, they're taking American jobs. Old immigrants were good, new immigrants are bad, they bring crime, they spread disease, they will never learn the English language. And I tell them, like, look, if you have an Italian or a Polish last name, they're predicting in 1922 that you, 100 years later, will still not speak English, right? And so the structure of the arguments are the same, and those movements are always tied to a form of far-right authoritarianism, generally, because they're seeing that an open society cannot accommodate for their kind of views. They have to close down the voting process, or they have to restrict the electorate in certain ways. And anti-immigration politics is oftentimes a way of restricting the electorate. And once you start restricting it with one group, the authoritarian trends and dynamics become vaster, and that circle can expand to encompass everybody, right?
Yeah, just to add, that period, and especially after 1924, there was a lot of resistance to both Jewish and Catholic immigration. The claims were, according to Linda Gordon, who's written a lot on this, that Catholics would be more loyal to the Pope. There were accusations of alcoholism and other things, stereotypes. In the case of Jews, it was Bolshevism, usually. There was a fear that Jews coming from these, really fleeing from these areas, Eastern Europe especially, would be bringing Bolshevism, but also untrammeled capitalism, and how these things coexist is always very interesting. Jews are accused of both, but of course that's this deep-seated fear of Jewish economic power that can take various forms. But I just want to say, because not many people really know about this, is it couldn't have come at a worse time. The pogroms of 1919 and 1921 in mainly Ukrainian territories were absolutely unprecedented. Death tolls of over 100,000. If it weren't for the Holocaust, this is what we'd be talking about, is the major genocide, or at least close to genocide. So this happened, and of course, vast sexual violence and destruction of property and everything else that goes along with it. So Jews are really desperately trying to get out of Ukrainian and other East European territories, and trying so hard to come to America, and that's when the door is shut. So it's just extra painful to think about that.
No, I think it's interesting for audiences to think back to the fact that before 1921 and then 1924, America had very open borders. It was extremely easy to get here. And then in 1965, when, thanks to the same congressman who, a wonderful character from New York, Emanuel Sellers, Lyndon Johnson passed the great immigration reform bill, but set up the dynamics of the immigration debate that we're having now, because you solve it for one part of the world and you create it for another. So I find it interesting, because I don't know if there's, and you guys will know this much more than I do, I don't think there's actually any evidence for immigrants doing all the things that we're frightened of. In fact, I think it's quite the opposite. Immigrants have made this country a much stronger, more prosperous and wonderful place to be historically in every generation. So it's fascinating to me that this continues to be a kind of drumbeat of American life when in fact, I don't think it has, whatever my personal views, I also don't think it's objectively anything that people should be concerned about. And, to kind of get away from that rather than to see it bubbling up again is deeply discouraging, I have to say.
And Sarah, again, I'm just so surprised. You started this project in 2015, and so much of what we are talking about tonight, you couldn't have predicted in 2015, and yet it's so relevant to your film.
Right, well, it gave the film a whole different personality and urgency while we were making it, I will say that, and sort of how we start the film and how we end the film, which I won't ruin for those of you who haven't seen it, but, Donald Trump hadn't been elected, Charlottesville hadn't happened, Pittsburgh hadn't happened, January 6th hadn't happened, let alone everything going on the other side of the world, and Hungary is a really interesting place, and the Horthy government and its role in the war, and also, there's so much discussion here about was FDR an anti-Semite? Did he do enough? Lots of thinking about him in particular and his government. And one of the great things he did was help get the War Refugee Board to get the large population of Hungarian Jews who were left back here. So anyway, it's always complicated, and that makes us able to have a job.
In the film, we hear of people, including Connecticut's own Hiram Bingham, who stepped up and saved the lives of thousands of Jews. As we wrap up this portion of the evening, could we talk about, sorry, I got lost here. How can each of us do our part to protect democracy and learn the lessons history teaches us so we won't repeat it again?
I'll start for a second and pass it to both of you. I think one thing the film does raise are the individual human choices that we all make every day, small and big. And people like Hiram Bingham and Varian Fry made very interesting choices in those moments. So did Polish Catholic teenagers who helped save Jews in a farmhouse. And it's really fascinating, and I think students love to think about, what choice would I make? What choice would my mother make? Why did some people do X and other people do Y? And what animates the decisions, small and big, in times of crisis? So that's how I would start my answer to that. But yes, didn't Hiram Bingham then have sort of an anti-Semitic end to his life? So he's complicated too, right?
Yeah, I would just echo that. And I'm glad you brought up Polish rescuers, because usually people don't know about it. Individual choices at the micro level, I think, is something I would emphasize. And how many times have you been in some sort of social situation and you hear something that's intolerant, stereotype, and you ask, should I really push back, or is it going to make everything unpleasant and ruin the party? And I think it's so important to push back. Some of my most influential times as a child was seeing my father stand up to racism, when he'd hear it in casual conversation. I think that's the beginning of deciding how you would behave, in this particular situation. Would you withstand the test? Well, if you can't make a party unpleasant, then you got a lot of problems when it comes to much bigger incidents.
Yeah, I think it's on that same vein. It's just daily, quotidian acts, right? So I've done a lot of writing on anti-fascism and studied that. And when after Charlottesville in 2017, a lot of people around me wanted to join anti-fascist organizations, and I kind of helped to facilitate a little of that. And that's really about kind of really monitoring and keeping tabs on kind of far right mobilizations, kind of like the Southern Poverty Law Center. But soon we found in my little corner of Connecticut there wasn't much of that kind of organized activity. So what we a lot of the folks who kind of were interested in saving democracy, I think, started doing other things, other acts of solidarity, right? Other forms of solidarity, because if you think about it, what's at the root of fascism is a desire to exacerbate social hierarchies and make social hierarchies concrete. So anything you can do, any acts of solidarity that actually loosen the boundaries between groups, that actually loosen social hierarchies, So what some of us started to do, we started a nonprofit called the Neighbor Fund in our little town of Windham that was devoted for legal defense for asylum seekers and immigrants into the country, and it still exists, right? But I think for me, that became, for me personally, that kind of immigrant solidarity work was much more kind of meaningful and also much more needed than, in our corner of Connecticut at least, kind of a literal anti-fascist group, right? And that's, you know, but there's moments when it depends on where you are, you know, where you're situated, you know, but I think it really does go back to those kind of daily quotidian acts, right?
Thank you so much. So now's the opportunity for the audience to get involved. If you'd like to ask a question of the panel, we have a microphone here, we have one back there, and if you just line up.
And I'm going to say goodnight. Thank you so much for having me. It's really been so much fun, and I'm sorry to miss the Q&A portion.
Sarah Botstein.
All of us major American students, so.
Right here.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. I wish you were here for this question. No, she's not stopping. In any case, Rachel Maddow just came out with a multi-part podcast called Ultra, which talks to the history of the influence of the Nazis on the U.S. Congress in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. I wonder how you see that, her material, if you've listened to it, interfacing or even becoming somewhat separate from what was done in the documentary.
No, this is the second time I've been asked tonight if I've seen that documentary, and sorry. I was like, oh no, I've got to watch that. But there has been more research that's come out. I can't speak to the congressional part because I haven't seen that particular documentary, but there has been more research on how, again, Coughlin's Christian Front movement that was mentioned in the film had literal connections to Nazi Germany and was actually there were the members of some of the members of Coughlin's Christian Front were actively kind of going back and forth to Nazi Germany, offering Hitler tips on how to reach out to American Catholics and how not to alienate American Catholics in his rhetoric, and also trying to get letter writing campaigns. Some of the people in the Christian Front were trying to do letter writing campaigns in the United States to make the Army, the U.S. Army, shift its rifles to different rifles that the German intelligence thought would be beneficial for, for Germany in the case that if they went up against the U.S. in the war. So there were moments of interaction, definitely between these movements that were mentioned in the film and literal kind of Nazi espionage, right?
Question right here.
Hi, I'm just curious if there are any examples of how propaganda was countered in the past that we can use today in the digital era?
Great question.
Propaganda is very powerful because it works on stereotypes, and I would say the grueling method of education and complicating and nuancing, histories and cultures is a very important way to combat the propaganda. Propaganda works because it's a very singular, simple message, and unfortunately, the only way is to complicate things, but also dehumanize. I think that, these groups who are being targeted by propaganda are being dehumanized. And the personal stories are one way of really cutting through a lot of that dehumanization, which is, what happened in this film a lot, where you can actually see individual stories and then relate to your own life, and somehow they don't seem so foreign and so threatening. These seem to be the best ways as far as I can see.
Thank you.
It was mentioned that democracy itself, electing leaders, is a way to fight autocracy. But that's been proven not to be true. We have people who are elected and then become autocrats, and we have examples in Hungary, and we have examples in Turkey. It's a very common thing when a leader is elected and then they decide that they're going to stay in power. So democracy by itself is not necessarily a barrier to autocracy.
I can hit on that. I think that's absolutely correct. And I think one of the things that it's kind of come out with one of the things that actually saved the United States in the last election cycle in 2020 was less actual laws on the books than kind of customs and a cultural sense of the rule of law amongst officials entrusted with the transfer of power, particularly secretaries of state at the state level, right? So what the insidious things about an authoritarian leader is that they instill a distrust in that basic sense of rule of law, right? And the thing that I was been most kind of concerned about since the 2020 election was actually the rooting out of officials who had that basic sense of a rule of law, rooting them out and replacing them with partisan hacks who will do whatever the authoritarian leader says, right? And it seems like in this last election cycle, we dodged a bullet to a point, but that cultural sense of rule of law can always be eroded, and I absolutely agree that, you know, one of the things that's different between communist revolutions and, you know, fascist takeovers or right-wing authoritarian takeovers, communist revolutions have never happened in places that had a tradition of kind of liberal democracy to begin with, but fascist takeovers and far-right coups almost always happen in places that had a democracy to begin with. So the mere existence of a democracy is not enough, right?
Any other questions? No? Okay. Well, here's something that I do when I interview someone. We'll go through the prepared questions, and then the last thing I'll say, is there anything else that you'd like to add, or anything else you'd like to say? And almost always, that's where all the gold comes from. That's when I get all the good answers. So, gentlemen, I'd be curious about your thoughts on the evening and, you know, ideas that kind of popped in your head as we were discussing tonight.
I guess what really occurred to me was just how courageous this kind of documentary was at a time when such things are under siege. You know, everybody is I would say drawing the lines at this point and saying, you can't say this, you can't attack the U.S. And here is this I felt extremely honest portrayal of our own past through the prism of, you know, years during the Holocaust, and kind of really held up a mirror to our whole society, you know, where we could see our flaws. And I think we come out of this okay, you know. It's going to be all right. Like it's okay to actually face up to some of the failings of our past, and maybe times when we weren't such a land of opportunity that we were told we are. It's okay. We come out of this better, and that's just the thing that strikes me the most. The part about the anti-Semitism, okay, you know, Jews play a certain role in the kinds of conspiracy theories that lead to deadly results, you know, as we saw. And you know, so the other thing I would say is just trying to understand more about Jewish history and humanizing Jews as individuals, as a cultural, really as a diaspora, a stateless diaspora throughout most of its history, just trying to survive and lead a decent life and have their identity intact, and trying to actually empathize with these outgroups, these marginalized groups, is something that should also, I think, come out of all of this.
Yeah, I think that's a great question too, because when you start going into this territory, it's really dark stuff, right? And I always tell my students in a class I teach called Fascism and Its Opponents that I'm going to end with a picture of puppies or something like that, you know, to make this a little bit, to make this wash down a bit better. But I think one of the things that really is to maybe end with puppies here a little bit, just keeping in mind with when they showed the image of the Fritz Kuhn rally and the German-American Bund rally in Madison Square Garden in 1939, there's 22,000 kind of fascists inside of the auditorium. There's about 50,000 people outside protesting it, right? At least, maybe more, right? And they got into scuffles with police and all this kind of stuff. And so, and that's what I've seen, and every time I've seen kind of a, you know, white nationalist kind of speak locally, those folks are outnumbered, and they've always been outnumbered, not just in this country, but in most countries, right? And there was a Woody Guthrie song from 1944 that I always end with my class with, which is called "You Fascists Bound to Lose," right? Which is historically borne out. They can do a lot of damage along the way, but at the end of the time, there's always more people against them than for them.
Great. Christopher Viles, Glenn Diner, thank you so much. A special thank you to our hosts from Westport Library, especially Jennifer Keller and the production crew here at the library, top notch, thank you. Our partners from the Jewish Federation of Greater Fairfield, Karen Saville and Stacy Commissar, thank you so much. My colleagues at Connecticut Public, Mark Contreras, Deirdre Tavera, and Joe Koss, thank you so much. And thank you for joining us this evening and online as well. Have a wonderful rest of your evening. Thank you.